Hello, everybody. Thank you for joining us. I'm Mike, 30 years in the world of sustainable business, much of it in the food industry. And in that time, I've seen tremendous change to the environment, to farming practices. And those challenges that we look at today will only multiply in the future. So I'm delighted to be sort of moderating this event, working with the RSPB on this, to ensure that we have a conversation about the role of nature in future farming systems. Now, just a few words of housekeeping before we get started. We're recording this event, so just so everybody's aware. You as sort of viewers of this won't be able to come on video or speak, but you will be able to use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen to raise any questions with us. We've only got a short amount of time. We probably won't be able to get through all the questions in time, but we'll make sure that we respond to any that we miss out at a subsequent date as well. So look, we're delighted that we've got a great panel today, and I'm going to ask them to sort of come up on screen now to join me, say a few words of introduction about themselves before we get started. Jo, Andy, Mark, delighted to see you today. Jo, I'm just going to ask you to sort of say a few words of introduction to yourself, why you're here, then I'll pass to Andy and then over to Mark for some introductory remarks as well. Jo.
Of course, thanks, Mike. So hi, I'm Jo. I'm from Summerdown. I'm the Chief Mint Officer at Summerdown, which basically means I get to think, talk, and dream about peppermint all day, every day. I've got the honour of leading the company that my grandfather founded and working with an amazing team of both farmers, but also brand and product specialists. And so we are the peppermint people at Summerdown, and we grow, harvest and distill our unique Black Mitcham peppermint and turn it into an amazing range of all sorts of products, including our award-winning and Fair to Nature scheme certified peppermint chamomile and peppermint and chamomile tea. And I'm here to talk about what we're doing and how we're doing it.
Thank you, Joe. What a brilliant job description. I think at least half of us in this audience are already got a degree of envy about the role that you've got. Thank you. Andy, if I can turn to you.
Hi, I'm Andy Gray. I farm down in Devon on Elston Farm. We are regen farmers. We're also vertical integrators, so we tend to take to market anything we produce. We've got our own mobile slaughterhouse, which is the only one in the UK, and we also our meat butchers. We supply hotels and restaurants. We're also certified Fair to Nature, and it's been a very interesting experience, sort of seeing how, having transitioned into a regen system, how Fair to Nature can recognise what we do. Thank you.
Andy, thank you. And seeing the sun streaming in over your shoulder reminds me we've not seen much of that this winter down in Devon. It's been quite a tough time farming in prolonged rain, has it not?
It has. It's been pretty shocking, really.
Yeah. Well, welcome to the future, I'm afraid, if this climate crisis continues to unfold as we predict it will. Mark, if I can just pass to you and introduce yourself, and I think you'll also be saying a few introductory words as well about the good work that you're doing. Over to you.
Yeah, thank you, Mike, and thank you, Jo and Andy. We're very lucky to have representation from across the supply chain this afternoon, both from Jo and from Andy, from farmers, from brand owners, and Mike overseeing us as an experienced retailer and sustainability advisor. My name's Mark. I'm head of Fair to Nature, nearly 20 years involved in sustainable food. Thank you for joining us. Really here to talk partly and mainly about the role of the Fair to Nature Mark and our new report, which you haven't seen it, you should be able to find a link on social media. Without nature, there is no food, that came out a few weeks ago. And welcome everybody. We've got a good representation from attendees this morning, from NGOs, from other NGOs and wildlife NGOs, from food businesses across the supply chain, food service operators, food brands and retailers. So thank you for joining us. And we need a broad range of organisations because we need to be addressing biodiversity loss on farm, which is a serious issue, not only because we care about food as people, but also the importance of food to our food production. So over the past 50, 60 years, we've lost enormous amounts of habitat across our farm systems. Over 50% of our hedgerows. They say 97% of our wildflower meadows, and that's had a shocking impact on species abundance. 64% of flying insects they talk about, which is a shocking number, and over 50% of our farmland birds, mammals and amphibians. And that's important, as I said, not just because nature is beautiful, but nature is critical. We talk about that in the report, about how we need we need nature, we need the insects, the pollinating insects, particularly for our fruit products, for the apples, for the berries that we grow across the UK. We need the beneficial insects that that go into field, particularly into arable field, and reduce our need for pesticides and protect us against the risk of those insects that are likely to adapt away from how effective those pesticides are. And we need all sorts of ecosystem services to help recycle nutrients within livestock systems, and particularly the things like dung beetles and other recycling invertebrates. So we talk in the report about how the Fair to Nature standards has evolved over time. So Fair to Nature was based originally on the conservation grade standard. That's evolved over time. It has evolved. It's partly now based on the farm wildlife principles, which were developed in partnership with some other wildlife NGOs, people like Bug Life and Plant Life and the Bumblebee Conservation Trust and 5 or 6 other brilliant wildlife NGOs. Because in order to sort of support ecosystems on farm, we need to think about all wildlife as we do. Lisa, if you just pop the chart, the Fair to Nature standard on, and it's really based on some science over the years, some good research which underpins the standard, and talks about how that we need a range of habitats. The science suggests between 8 and 10% of farmland, farm area needs to have a range of habitats available on farm to support ecosystems and therefore restore or protect biodiversity on farm to deliver those essential services that we need to be able to grow our food. I should also say that a lot of that change was driven by government policies, particularly around the post-war period, and this kind of obsession with short-term food security. Well, what we say now is, without nature, there is no food, and we really need to make sure we restore ecosystems and habitats so that we have long-term food security with nature providing those services. Thank you, Mike.
Thank you for those introductory words, Mark. Much appreciated. And I'm going to turn to Andy now, because again, we've heard from Mark how important biodiversity is to a functioning food system, a farming system. You know, farmers are juggling ever more. It's ever getting ever harder to be a farmer in this sort of complex world, and weather extremes, nature loss is just making that harder and harder. So again, I'd appreciate understanding practically how you're putting nature at the heart of your business and why it's so very, very important. And then I'll come back in a moment and Mark, just get your perspective on building off Andy's points. Andy, over to you.
So, I mean, as farmers, we're becoming increasingly, we're beginning, amazingly, we finally worked out the soil's quite important, and that's the basis of all the biodiversity that we've got around us, because it's a sort of lower trophic levels, but it's also the having naturally functioning soils does help us. It's the medium through which all our crops grow, and it has to be the thing that delivers the water and the nutrients and all that sort of thing to us. So the very initial basis of our farming system change was to improve our soils and to allow to feed them continually by having continuous green cover on them, diversify the nature of our swards. So we're going from single species Italian or perennial ryegrasses out into things like herbal lays, where we've got 17 to 19 different species in a sward, all growing at different speeds and feeding the soil in different ways, but also flowering at different times of the year. So providing nectar sources for different insects at different times of the year. And therefore the insects will go on to feed the birds, and the birds other things, and so it goes on. So additional diversity in our systems has definitely helped increase our the sort of resilience of our system, because it sort of hedges our bets against different weather and climatic conditions and that sort of thing. And at the same time has increased the amount of nature we have on our farm. We were also experimenting with 26 acres of silvopasture, and we can see that that's a remarkably good solution to future extremes of climate, because it protects our livestock from excessive heat or excessive wind and rain, and also it adds to the porosity of our soils by putting more carbon into them, which builds soil structure, and the deep fissures that roots can produce will also help water run into them. That slows down water crossing the landscape, which means that our nutrients stay on our land, but it also protects people downstream from us from peak flooding events. It just slows the flow and allows more water to sink into the ground rather than run across the top and wash off our topsoils and take away nutrients which are better on my land where they're supposed to be than in a river, causing problems to salmonids and all the other fish, or going out into the sea and creating algal blooms where we don't want them either. So all these different, we're just touching on a few of the ideas that we have here. Nature tends to thrive when you've got a patchwork of diversity and a patchwork of food sources. So one of the principles we try to stick to with our farming system here is to have smaller plots of production and diversity within those plots, and all of those that sort of change of practice has definitely increased the amount of nature we've got. When I was a child, we had a lot of nature, and anecdotally, I've lived my life in a hedge looking out at stuff, and there's a lot less stuff to look out at. So it's exciting when you change your practices and see the way nature blooms around you because of it. Thank you.
And Andy, I'm going to bring Mark into the conversation now, but you're right at the heart of the farming community in the Southwest. It's more than just the land that you specifically farm. What are other farmers saying to you about the shift that you've made? Do they feel it's scary? Do they think it's irrelevant? What's the message from the wider farming community?
I think they're glad I'm making my changes before them, so they can see whether it works for me. The interesting thing is, when people do try these changes, on the whole, they become converts quite quickly, and there is a remarkable. It's extraordinary, but the mainstream farming press has picked up on this. So 5 years ago, you had nothing about this in Farmers Weekly. Now it's back-to-back information on these systems. They're seeing that not only. Some people, farmers are a spectrum. You go from totally disinterested to totally engaged. But they are all interested in being financially sustainable, and they're seeing that what we're doing is potentially financially more sustainable. And finally, after 6 years of waiting, with the SFI, the Sustainable Farming Incentive options are coming through, and they are looking quite good. And the joy with Fair to Nature potentially is that it will help people identify and adopt some of the options that are on there, and those options will pay for fitting into the Fair to Nature certification schemes. So there's a sort of nice coming together of them in a moment in time there.
And Andy, I'm going to come back to so much of what you've opened up with. I'm going to, how to develop a business case to encourage more farmers to do this, how to use the subsidy system so much better than we've been able to help farmers with to date. And just one word of clarification for the landlubber, the guy that doesn't get his hands dirty in the field. Silver pasture, by that you mean the use of forestry, timber, both as a crop and habitat on the farm?
It's a fancy name for trees in a field, and particularly in our case, a grass field. So we graze livestock through it, and then we're enterprise stacking as well as improving the existing productivity of the system. So it's potentially a vastly more productive with vastly fewer inputs, and therefore, what's there not to like? More money at the end, hopefully.
Brilliant. We're coming back to that, I'm sure. Mark, if I'll just bring you back to the conversation now. Again, we're hearing from Andy real life examples about he's got a better farm by putting nature at the heart of it. I mean, how much real life practical experience or evidence have you got that backs the standard that you're developing now?
Well, the standard has evolved, as I said, has evolved over since the mid 80s when conservation grades started. So it's a sort of an approach which is extended as well by thousands of incredible farmers within the Nature Friendly Farming Network. And if you want to find out more, I thoroughly recommend people check out their website. Not all those farms are certified, but many of the principles around supporting habitats, incorporating the sorts of systems, the approach to soil, the incorporation of livestock into farming in that way has been is being shared by those members. And what really many of the nature friendly farming members say to us is they're keen to get their products to market and are waiting for the wheat, the buyers, the oat buyers, the milk buyers, the cheese buyers, etc., to support them to go on that journey towards certification. Can I just touch on what Andy was talking about, the government support? Because I think there is, only the week before last, is coinciding with the Oxford Farming Conferences, the government provided an update to their agricultural transition plan, and they're really keen to get 70% of farmers incorporating nature into their farming, and are giving a direction. They talk about 10% of the land being managed well for nature. So this is strategically something the government is keen for us to do, because they recognise not just that it's important to us as citizens, but also the productivity benefits of having nature incorporated into systems. And the other thing that the NFFN, the Training Farming Network, talk about is, which is kind of touching on Andy there, is not just looking at yield, but also looking at profitability. What the farmers say to us is they're driving their profitability because they're not using as many inputs, whether it's chemical inputs. I mentioned some of the recycling insects, things like dung beetles, actually apparently reduce the need to, I don't have to explain why, but reduce the need for antibiotics within livestock farming. So I think the direction the government's taking us in, I say that as a non-farmer, is brilliant, because it's rewarding farmers, paying farmers for putting the right habitats in place around their farm.
Yeah, Mark, thank you very much. And Jo, I'm going to bring you up into the conversation now as well, just to join Andy, just to sort of explore how do we scale this practically. I think, Andy, you've made a very compelling case about how you've transformed your farm, and we're going to unpick the business case a little bit later for that. But we're all part of a wider food system. There are retailers, there are brands, there are processors, there are input manufacturers, there are farmers as well. And I feel for the farming community, because ultimately they are responding to the very powerful signal sent from either the subsystem, big government, or the signal sent by big retailers and big brands and their buying practices as well. So, Jo, if I can just start with you, how have you started to bring this very different approach to farming into your value chain? Because you've got people above you and you've got people behind you. What are the conversations you're having? What are the barriers you're having to overcome with them to drive this in your business?
Yeah, thanks, Mike. I suppose we're at Summerdown coming from an interesting perspective, in that we've been Fair to Nature Farm for over a decade now, and longer than that. And we've been on a journey as a farm for many years. Our master of mint, our farm manager Ian Margaret, has been a phenomenal advocate for nature-friendly farming, for doing things in a way that provides for people and the environment in equal measure. And so I suppose I'm able to come and advocate from a position that we've been doing it for a while, and it works, because our outlook on what success looks like isn't dictated necessarily by just expansion at all cost. And so the barriers that we see are the fact that, one, we live in a society where it is, as you say, big business or the state that is determining and setting the agenda. And that can make it very hard for small farmers, for small businesses, for startups to advocate and operate for change when it can be dominated by these large players. And so I think fundamentally, what's the one thing we can really do to help start to affect change in a way that isn't dominated by the big players, is to reconnect back into the natural environment. We exist in a society which is quite detached from our environment around us, and the ecology and the nature around us, which makes it very hard when you're trying to make business decisions, particularly as a small business. At Summerdown, we're a small business. There are always more important, more pressing, more timely matters at hand. And if you're not rooted in, connected to the natural environment around you, it becomes almost impossible then to bring nature in to that decision making, to think about biodiversity loss, to think about the natural environment in what sales or marketing decision you're about to make. As a farm-based business, we are, in my mind, very blessed in the fact that we can't move. We can't diversify away from what our core operating is, which is growing award-winning peppermint, putting it into an amazing range of products, and able to delight our audience with great tasting products, but grown in a way that sees the environment come alive.
Yeah, I'm going to come to Andy in a second, but it just makes me reflect listening to you that a lot of the work that I did at Marks and Spencer, 20 years there leading sustainability, was to use better ingredients as part of the quality proposition. This can't be quality product if it's exploited the planet to get to you, however good it might taste. That is just not quality in the 21st century. So it's really interesting to see you differentiate your products around nature as a quality, part of the quality experience for your customer as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And we, one of the sayings I have is profit at whose expense. It's all well and good to make a bit of profit as a business, fundamental as a business to make profit, but ultimately at whose expense is this profit coming, and what's the term that we can extract that profit? And we're wanting to build something that is generational because it is rooted to the land, and we can only make something last so long as it is not exploiting the land, drawing out from it more than it is able to give.
And Andy, I'm just going to pop back to you, because you too have got a direct-to-consumer business model, which I think I'd just like to understand a little bit more how you're using nature to drive the growth of that business. But then after that, I'm going to give you permission to be in charge of the UK food system for 60 seconds. I'm sure it'd be better if you were in charge of it permanently, but 60 seconds. What would you be saying to the big retailers and the government DEFRA food subsidy system now to drive the food that we need at the price point that people are willing to pay, but also put environment much more at the heart of what we do? But tell us about the D2C model you've got at the moment.
So most of our customers are hotels and restaurants. They buy from us. They have done since 1955, and some of them have been there since 1955, bizarrely. So they just know who we are and what we do. So we don't have to do an awful lot there. We do meat boxes, and to sell meat boxes, you have to tell a story, and it's a niche. And the nature story is the story that most people want to hear. So that connection between them buying from somebody who they see and believe and has that credibility is what they want. I mean, when it comes to scaling it, obviously what we're doing is very small scale. So if you want widespread adoption, the joy with these certifications is that the story's told by a trusted NGO, and that story can be done for many farmers using case studies chosen from amongst us. But it allows a wide scale farm adoption across multiple farms in a much more efficient way. Most farmers aren't very good at telling stories, to be honest. Most farmers just want to produce stuff. That's what they want to do.
Yeah, and that's, to me, is the great integrity and honesty of farming. People just want to farm, and they want to farm well. I've never met a farmer that wants to exploit the planet. It's more a question of the system that they're forced to participate in, which is my point about the subsidy system and the retailer system. And I'll give you a perspective on the retailer system a little later in this conversation. This is very much about you, not my views, but I'll share some very, very brief words a little bit later. Jo, I mean, again, if we're going to see many more brands do things in the way that you do, both in terms of using the right standards and practices in the field, building a differentiator model where you can sell direct to the consumer, what have you learned about building that business? Because it can't be easy.
No, not at all. I mean, I often feel like we're in the episode of Wallace and Gromit, of The Case of the Wrong Trousers, building the train track as we go. And I think that there is an element of that for all businesses in the UK. I think particularly coming from a smaller enterprise, farm-based enterprise, we don't have large structures and teams and sustainability department and an HR department. We're a small, coherent team built around our belief that what we're doing on the farm is beautiful, it's good, and we want to share that good news and story. So what's the barrier to other businesses getting involved? I suppose my perhaps more provocative answer is that we need to redefine what our definition of good looks like. And I'll often coalesce around the fact that what we're trying to aim for in our growth and long-term viability as a business looks like a tree. that a tree, a magnificent oak tree, has years, hundreds of years of expansion, but it reaches its maturity and it no longer expands. But every year there is regeneration, there is growth, there is life. And we are hooked on an expansion mindset. And until we can start seeing growth and business as an active regenerative endeavor rather than just expansive, we're going to struggle to connect what is good for nature, what's good for our consumers and our customers, and what's good for the underlying business. It's going to be very hard to make those connections work.
Gotcha. And Andy, just sort of nipping across to you, because again, we've said you're at the heart of the Southwest farming community. You must have plenty of farmers visit you who are part of the current intensive system. What are they saying to you about the barriers they face in transitioning to what you do? And let's just start picking out, it's quite an ugly word, but let's use it, the business case for farming with nature at the heart of it. What discussions are you having with your fellow farmers?
Well, I mean, but thing you have to remember, most farmers are my age and older, and they've been doing a high input system all their lives. And to change that is actually challenging the last 40 years of their lives. So it's quite a tough conversation, but they are intrigued by it. And because the area-based payments are going, they are much more open to change, and quite a lot are changing. There's quite a lot not changing as well, and there is a potential movement towards a higher input and an even worse system to try to stave off financial difficulties. I mean, the one thing I would say is when you look at the way nature responds to a regenerative system, and when you then look at the last 60 years of complete disaster when it comes to nature, this isn't, this is a real thing. We need to do it, and we need to do it really, really quickly. And it's trying to get that message across to people that transition has to happen. But transition comes with risks, so we need to de-risk it. And some of the government payments are quite helpful, but potentially there'll be partnerships with corporates who can do offset payments and that sort of thing to help de-risk it in the short term. In the medium term, I think once you've transitioned to a low input system, you tend to stick to it, because you realize that the price of food stays pretty well the same all the time, and the only way to increase your margin is to have fewer inputs whilst producing a similar amount. And that's what you find when you move to a regen system. Growing food is a natural process, so why are you surprised when other natural processes help you? Some will hinder you, but some will help you. So if you can use natural processes to reduce your reliance on tractors, chemicals, bag nitrogen, and all that sort of thing, and use the natural cycling of nature to help you grow your crops, there's nothing not to like there, really. And you're just reducing your costs while maintaining similar outputs.
Gotcha. And I was really intrigued listening to you talking about, again, given all the recent rain and flooding that we've had, how you're using your land to attenuate water flows. So rather than all rushing off, taking the soil off your land and flooding the nearby village or town or the local river, you're providing a service to society on that.
And myself at the same time. I mean, resilience is one of my favorite words. We're building more resilient systems, and to do that, it's a little bit of a dive into geeky science. But the more carbon you can put into your soil, the more that carbon will build your soil structure by sticking the smaller particles into bigger particles and creating bigger gaps, and that increases your porosity. So within 2 years of changing from a plough-based system to a min-till system, all the houses downstream from my farm that used to flood don't flood anymore. It's as simple as that. And all my crops, which used to die in June before I harvested them in drought years, now have enough water to see them through. So the water goes into the ground and stays in the ground. So it's and once you've seen that, it's so completely convincing. You just don't want to go back to any other system, really. I mean, the other thing I would say from a point of view of finances of these things is fair to nature is all about fair to farmer as well. And we have to have systems where the buyers recognise the need for that, for continuous recognition of what the farmer's done, and the continuity of purchasing and a stable environment, because that's what we need. We're long-term investors in short-term cycles.
And a couple of thoughts just to riff off what you said. I mean, first, resilience. You know, the globe has just lived through the warmest year on record. This year is likely to be hotter again. Weather extremes are only going to get more extreme. So welcome to the future. It's been tough to be a farmer the last 12 months. It's going to be even tougher into the future. So future-proofing your business, the value of your land by investing in the resilience of your land, I think, incredibly important. I think that's worth notice. I would also say pressure back onto the retailers, the brands and government and the subsidy system to recognise that the services that farmers do, not just environmentally, but I think I've also heard socioeconomically. And again, we've seen right across Europe at this moment in time, a lot of farmer movements. We've seen it in Holland, we've just seen it in Germany, resenting the way that cities or urban elites are forcing change upon them without the support or the recognition of their hard work. And I think we have to find standards that are good for nature and socioeconomically good for farmers and their communities as well. I mean, Jo, again, I'm just going to pop across to you because I told you the story about quality at M&S and using sustainability to emotionally contribute to that. Do you actually think it's improved the quality, the demonstrable quality of the ingredients you use in your products because you've put nature at the heart of your farm?
Yeah, absolutely. So I can talk about our peppermint, our chamomile, and also our lavender. It has a huge impact for, I suppose, two examples. One is with our lavender, and so knowing that we've got beehives that local apiarists place beehives around all of our fields because they love the honey that it produces. But we just know that those pollinators are crucial for the long-term health of our lavender fields. And so we've got fields now that have been producing beautiful lavender for over 20 years. For our peppermint, it started with a bit of a harebrained dream and passion from my grandfather and with Ian, our master of mint. They got some small plugs from a farmer in America. They planted it in one small corner of one of the fields on the farm. And 30 years later, we're now growing around 100 acres of peppermint, all directly related back to that very first plug that we planted in the field. And without creating a long-term sustainable farming system that puts nature right at the centre of our decision making, we wouldn't have been able to see the mint flourish in the way that it has, because it's a very kind of fickle crop. It doesn't really like lots of rain. It likes a nice amount of sun, but it also doesn't like no rain. It requires just the perfect environment, which we can never give it. But because we're seeing pollinators use the field, wildlife run through, we're seeing our wildflower borders around all of these fields teeming with different insects, different invertebrates. We know that is having a huge impact on the growth of the mint, which enables us to produce something that has genuine value, both to the farm, but also to the brand that it's then sold into. And I think the fundamental point here is about longevity, that anyone can do something with enough capital for a short amount of time. It's about creating something that is truly enduring because it is reliant on the natural environment to help sustain what's been created.
Thank you. I'm just going to ask Andy one final question in this section, then we're going to sort of turn to sort of consumer engagement, and I'll invite Mark back to the floor. But Andy, you've painted a really inspiring picture of what you've achieved, where your farm has got to, but it can't have been easy. It can't be. We can't look at this through rose-tinted spectacles. What were the challenges? What went wrong? What have you learned so others don't make those mistakes?
I think I might be the exception, because actually my soil is really good and very responsive, and it has been easy for me. But I think for others in different, farming is so context driven. It so much depends on quality of soil, depth of soil, market, previous history, so many other things. So I'll try and address it as somebody who's had a tougher time. Sometimes you do get a yield drop for a few years until your soil goes through a transition. Just happens mine is particularly responsive, so I didn't. It is just a different mindset. It's like the change between driving a diesel car and an electric car. You just approach life in a slightly different way to do it, and that can be challenging for a lot of people. I personally love change, so I just embraced it anyway. And actually, I just love nature. So from my point of view, there's a pleasure in it. And you don't get taxed to live in a lovely place, so why not just make it lovely?
Yeah. Brilliant.
I'm too rose tinted, I'm afraid, but I can't help it.
Yeah, I get the passion. I get the passion, but I guess the homework question for all of us is scale. You know, I love the story that you've both told, but I need to see 10, 50, 100,000 farmers supported to be able to deliver what you've got out and off your own backs. You've achieved what you've done with limited support from others around you. I think plenty of other farmers will need a much bigger wraparound system to get to where you've got to as well, which we'll come back and reflect on in a minute. I'm going to invite Mark back to the stage to join Jo for a little conversation about that consumer engagement, really important. A little reminder to the audience, so thank you for the questions that are coming in. That's brilliant, and we'll make sure that we spend a few minutes trying to address those towards the end of our time together. So any more questions, ping them up there for us. But Mark, if we can just draw you back into the conversation, what's your ambition in terms of building awareness amongst consumers about the Fair to Nature logo, to get them to make different choices, which in turn then creates a virtuous circle of more businesses wanting to use it? Do you think people really want nature at the heart of their shopping expedition?
People really care about nature. I think Lisa might pop some slides up in a second that show some of the key points that we raise in the report. We found that over a third of people, when asked, said that they really cared about nature when they're concerned about nature. 78% say they're concerned about biodiversity loss. And yeah, there's some relatively, it's sometimes difficult to claim. If people say one thing in surveys and then they do something else. And I've worked, as I said before, I've worked in the food industry for a long time. And I feel that the food industry has begun to respond on climate, but that's a hard thing to talk about with individuals, with shoppers. And one of the most striking pieces of research that hit me was that question about which people want UK farmers to prioritise, because preserving and enhancing nature and wildlife was the highest environmental priority that people were flagging, as opposed to water, which was just behind, soil and carbon. But you think of the amount of coverage that we get, not just within food circles, not just within the food industry and our response, but indeed within society, it's still the focus and the priority amongst citizens, amongst shoppers, amongst people buying your food, the food businesses, was on nature, despite the fact that there's very, very little communication and engagement on it. And I think that's partly because it's so close to us as individuals. You know, we can touch, we can see, we remember the butterflies, we can hear the bees, we can hear the birds, we can smell the soil when we've had that experience as individuals. So I think it's a very, very sort of relevant thing to engage with. So all of the research that we can see, and when we go out and talk to people in focus groups, is they care about nature. So I think that's why we're calling out for brands to support farmers within their supply chain, to go through a certification process, respond to actually some of those opportunities that government are providing. And I suppose people ask, well, why the RSPB? Why are you getting involved with that? And there's other stats within the research about the role of certification. I think Jo touched on it earlier, and the role of NGOs in being that third party, that independent, trusted reference point. Now, the RSPB logo, the RSPB organisation, is very well known and trusted. 75% of people, you know, as a minimum, aware of the RSPB logo. 71% or something trust it. So I think our role is we've got a science-backed standard. We've got advisors who know what they're doing in supporting farmers to go on that journey. And the plan for the Fair to Nature Mark, I'll be quite unapologetic, is to replicate what some of those other incredible focus certification schemes have achieved. Now, I said that I started in my work career in sustainability 20 years ago. Nearly 20 years ago, I joined the Fair Trade Foundation. And you're talking about quality earlier, Mike. And I think what Fair Trade helped, not only, but helped a lot of businesses to do is to bring the sourcing, the where their food came from, the cocoa, the sugar, the tea, to life in those supply chains. So our mission within Fair to Nature is to try and do what the Fair Trade movement achieved for growers and workers in the global south for incredible wildlife, biodiversity, and all sorts of species in UK farming. And to underpin the claims and the communication that businesses are putting, to act as a kind of bit of a shortcut and a prompt for people engaging in, when they're shopping, they don't always want to know the detail. There is the detail. We can support brands like we've already started to do with Summerdown and with Farm Wilder, and we do on the RSPB bird food. We can provide depth to it, but as a shortcut, certification can be a really useful way of saying to shoppers, look, this is what we're doing, and this is a trusted organization. And then we can help educate and enroll and envision people to do that across categories. So hopefully we'll be working with people who are buying the mint, or buy the meat, and hopefully buy the cheese and the bread and the milk that we hope to launch with partners in coming months.
And just a quick question for both of you, because we do live in a world that lacks trust, particularly in big business, but just generally lacks trust. A world full of greenwash, again, much of it perpetuated by big corporates rather than small operators. How are you making sure that your system will be trusted as it grows into the future? I mean, what's their approach on certification, verification, whilst also making sure it's sufficiently light touch that it doesn't become a burden for farmers operating on very tough margins as well? Mark, maybe first perspective from you, and then Jo.
Well, I think there's a couple of things. I think first and foremost, I'm not a farmer, but we have a steering committee of a technical committee of farmers who inform us on the development of the standard. And as we expand from the few licensees and a few products we've got on the market, we will make sure that that sort of governance structure replicates the market and the partnerships we're going. That's a well-trod. We've got to be accountable, but we've also got to work closely with those people who we're trying to deliver for. I think the other important point is that we provide advice to farmers on how to deliver the standard, and then that's checked externally by NSF, who are an external auditor, to verify independently that the process that we've agreed with the farmer has been met. So it's not just us marking our homework, but there's a trusted organization that carries out certification for many other certification schemes. And we'll try and minimize the amount of work the farmers need to do. So lots of farmers have a certification visit by an auditor at the same time as some of those other schemes. That's probably the initial response. I think Andy actually mentioned something about the Fair to Nature standard earlier on the week that would be great to bring him in on. But yeah.
Mark, very, very quickly, are you certifying or measuring inputs, as in terms of activities that are nature friendly, or outputs, which is here's evidence of better bird life, better soil, better outputs for nature? Where's the balance in your certification system?
So all of the science that the science on which the standard is based is focused on habitats, and the area of habitat and the quality of that habitat. And there's lots of science to prove that when those habitats are in place, that bird life, insect life, ecosystems are restored. And we've got measurement of selected farms that can prove that. It's quite a complex process to then do on every single farm to go through detailed analysis of species on those farms. But so the science is there to underpin it. We will, as we continue to expand, make sure that's checked. So we've got from some of our existing farms some pretty robust scientific surveys to show the species growth within that area. But the science underpins habitats drive outcomes. I don't know if it's a coincidence. That's what the government's trying to push and support farmers to deliver. 500,000 hectares of nature positive habitats they've targeted by 2042.
And again, I'll come back to the role of the big businesses in terms of driving some commonality of approach as we take these initiatives to scale. I mean, Jo, again, similar questions for you. I mean, what's it like as an experience to be certified to make sure that you've got evidence to back up your claims that you are fair to nature? And then how are you positioning the Fair to Nature logo or brand, as you use it, in front of your customers to engage them and drive the growth of your business?
Well, I suppose again, I can only share from being a long, we've been a long-term partner with the Fair to Nature mark as a Fair to Nature farm for many years. They're wonderful to work with. If you're a farmer on this call, pick up the phone to Mark. They're brilliant. But I think the more important thing and the bit that's probably more pertinent to this conversation is what does it actually mean? And I think the reason why we have really stuck with and wanted to partner kind of with Fair to Nature here is that there is a matter of integrity. that Mike, you touched on it, that a lot of trust has been eroded with consumers by largely through large corporations and some of the actions they've taken. I often feel what you see is there's a huge amount of transparency from some of the bigger players, where they put everything out there, but there's no context, there's no translation. The information is available, but it's very hard to read through it. And what we strive for at Summerdown is to be really have integrity of that compromise, and working with external parties like Fair to Nature, where we can be held accountable by people who are outside of our sphere of influence, but are trusted partners that we are looking to develop long-term relationship with. It means that we can grow this together, develop this together, so that we as a brand there is integrity in when we make claims. We're not saying we're self-marking. Look, here's how we set our structures and our systems up, so we can make that claim. The consumer angle of it as well is that we need to treat our consumers as partners, and not just as consumption units, but participants in a countrywide, global-wide move to see our nature restored. And if we don't treat consumers as participants, but rather just units, economic units that can consume what we're creating, again, we're missing that crucial connection, both back to nature, but to society at large. And so using the Fair to Nature mark as a way of showing with integrity, this is the standard with which we work to, which also, and it's always going to be uncomfortable, but it enables criticism. Well, we think that's wrong, but then you can engage in conversation, and you can bring your consumers, your partners, your supply chain on that journey, because you're working to a shared goal, a shared endeavour of seeing nature restored.
Joe, thank you. And if I'm going to invite Andy back up to the stage, because I want to now pivot to sort of taking a few questions that have been posted in the Q&A function, for which many thanks. And as we said, anything that we can't answer in the next 5-10 minutes, but clearly Mark will follow up with you separately. I mean, I've picked up sort of 3 themes that have coming out of those questions. And I'm going to sort of invite you to sort of provide views on any one of them, or any 2 or any 3. Probably come to you first, Andy, then Joe, then Mark. So the 3 themes I'm picking up is, and we've touched upon this a couple of times, how do we change the current way that big hospitality, big food, big retail, big brands buys food today, so nature becomes much more relevant to their buying choices? So there's something about changing the system to drive scale. The second one I've got is a really good question about democratizing or making better food available to everybody. There are so many people living in poverty now. Who'd have thought, 3 million people would be reliant on food banks in 21st century Britain? So how do we avoid the trap of this becoming for the 10% of middle-class eco-consumers, but no one else, because there's such a price premium? And the third thing, again, a good question that's come in about the relationship between Fair to Nature and an animal-based farming system. We've talked broadly about many different crops, but we've not faced directly into a meat and dairy system as well. So I'd appreciate any views on the relevance of that. But perhaps, Andy, I mean, touch on any of those, one of those, but you get the ball rolling.
Sure. I mean, food poverty is very close to my heart. We're very involved with food poverty as a company, and put huge quantities of meals into food banks, and I'm enormously aware of that disparity. And there's no particular reason, as I've said before, once you transition into these systems, there's no particular reason why this food should be dramatically more expensive. The thing we're doing is squaring off the societal cost, which really has never been part of the economic system that we recognise when producing food. We do, as farmers in a high input system, we do a lot of societal damage, and by not having those high input systems, we're actually pivoting in completely the opposite direction and doing producing an awful lot of societal gain. And on top of that, if we continue to denude our soils, then everybody's going to be in food poverty because we won't have any food. So it depends how far down the track you're looking. And I would say that there's an awful lot of time that farmers are given the guilt for an awful lot of things, like the price of food and things like that. We are producing remarkably cheap food already. And it just happens that we've set up our society in a completely potty way where we can't afford to live in our houses.
Yeah.
Don't give us the guilt of the fact that society's been set up in a completely potty way. From a point of view of the meat aspect of the side of things, it's always an interesting question. I think, as a principle, that we as butchers, we say to people less and better. In a northwestern European context, in a very temperate climate, we are pretty comfortable in our system of producing beef and lamb, or beef in particular, from a point of view of a balance of greenhouse gases. When farming in certain ways, we can actually address greenhouse gas problems, and there's an awful lot of science stacking up behind it. So it's a bit like, we know cars are bad. We don't immediately get rid of them. We just, first of all, the first thing to do is see how you can do it much, much better. And we can do most of these things much, much better, which is what the regenerative system is sort of leading towards. And the regenerative system is very, very good for biodiversity, because you produce all this churn and change using livestock within a patchwork of different agricultural habitats, and we've got 10,000 years of having a reasonably grazed landscape. I've got a huge number of friends who are very enthusiastic rewilders, and I thoroughly enjoy the whole rewilding side of things. And rewilders, what do they do to stop certain vegetations becoming dominant? They stick animals into the system. They might be wild ones, but they're still animals trashing the plant life and creating churn and change. So anyway, you've heard enough from me. Thank you.
And Andy, brilliant points again. And again, I would say on the point about meat, you've made a really important point. Less is better. I think this is where standards, certification and verification are really important, because I see a full spectrum out there of great claims, bad claims. I think everybody's a little bit unsure as to what is a good meat-based system, and we're going to have better standards to prove. But I also look at all the big commitments that big retailers have made now to cut their Scope 3 emissions. Much of it's driven by meat and dairy-based products in the basket. They too are going to have to scale some really interesting, robust standards with evidence that the meat they do sell is better as well. So, some real change coming across the system. Jo, if I can come to you just to get your perspective again on any or all of those questions.
Yeah, probably. I'll probably focus just on that first one of changing the system. It's as with all of these, this is not a simple question and answer, because if it was, it would already have been done. I think my approach is from the fact that we have to first engage in the messiness of it, the complexity of it, that there isn't a simple solution. And rather than trying to find what it could be, immerse ourselves in what the complexity looks like, and then from that complexity, with integrity and with kind of the honesty of having done the hard work, try and share. And this is what today is all about: try and share what has worked for us. Not that it's a model for replication, but we hope a touch point of inspiration. Others can do it in their way, in their context. That and so my kind of two pennies worth on how we change that system is seeing the primary producers, the farmers, in that supply chain as rather than production units, but being land stewards. That we are stewards for the farms and the land that we get to care for. And if the supply chain, and particularly thinking about the supply chain into large retailers and large brands who are taking a lot of the product, don't see that product in its true natural context, you are only going to be effectively asset stripping nature. And so what does it look like to create a purchasing system which encompasses the full context of where that food is from? And to do that, we also need to have a change to definition of what good looks like. And I strongly believe that our current model of what growth, success, and good is vastly out of date, and there needs to be a change. And I find it really encouraging that the route the government's going down with SFI and with ELMS, and so it's a really, really good shift that they are taking. It's lots of issues, and I don't want to go into the the details, but the direction of travel is excellent. My only reflection is, isn't it sad that we are reliant on government subsidies and government policy change to shift our behaviours and our attitudes? And so that for me is why it's about engaging with the consumer as participants, engaging in the complexity, and redefining what success looks like. Because by collaborating in conversation, new imaginations, new stories, new ways of working, I hope will emerge.
Thank you, Jo. I mean, I'm going to come back to Jo and Andy in a minute for a 30-second. One thing you really want people to remember from this webinar. Before I do that, Mark, any quick observations on those 3 questions I pitched into the room?
And I think on the pricing one, the jury's out to a certain extent, but a lot of feedback from farmers seems to be that it doesn't necessarily take cost any more to produce in that way. I think the biggest thing that I've heard, not from lots of small farmers I meet, from from senior folk from the NFU, is actually that shared risk. Particularly in arable systems and produce systems, there can be a shorter period where there's almost a transition where there can be some yield loss and potentially some profit loss. So I suppose it's actually working collaboratively between manufacturers, suppliers, and farmers along a longer period to say, yeah, we're going to go down this journey and incorporate regen and nature-friendly practices into our farming, but support us on that journey. And as a society, if we do that, we're going to be more resilient. And I think I should also mention, I'm sure there are some farmers and some businesses from outside of England on that. A lot of the funding that we have visibility on is in England. But I don't think it necessarily means, but certainly if we're going to create the change we need, because this is a crisis. I've asked colleagues before about putting some numbers on biodiversity loss in the same way as we have this 4-degree trajectory in climate. You cannot do it. It's too complex. So we don't actually know how much longer we've got with the pollinators, the beneficials and the recyclers before we fail. Yeah, I think we're right. In the interest of time, I'll probably leave it there, Mark.
Thank you. And if I just sort of finish off this little section, then literally there'll be 30 seconds each for the 3 of you in a second. I mean, my reflection, living and breathing in the food system, is it's hugely atomized. People know their specialism. Retailers know how to retail, producers, manufacturers, shippers, back down to farmers. But the food system is literally that. It's a system. We're all dependent upon each other. And yet we've fragmented it, so we've lost appreciation of each other's roles and our relationship with the wider environment. We're all dependent upon a functioning food system in the future. So I think you've been brilliant at sort of bringing so much to life in the last 55 minutes. I'm going to come to you, Andy, if we can just get 30 seconds reflections, then Jo, and then Mark, and then we'll close.
I think I'm going to reflect on what Mark said. It's a crisis. We're an emergency. We need to behave as if we're in an emergency and actually embrace all these changes that we need to pursue. And we need a bit of humility to realize that on some of these things we might be wrong, but on the whole, we have the anecdotal evidence and quite a lot of scientific evidence to prove that these systems which we're now adopting are actually enormously good for the environment.
Andy, thank you. Jo?
Yeah, I think the point I'll make of just engage in the complexity, but crucially find ways of enabling our consumers to become participants in this change, which dignifies them, dignifies us, and connects the food system to nature.
And Mark, the very last word for you.
One thing that I've not said is it is a systemic issue. We have a dual climate and nature crisis, but a lot of the interventions, the habitat interventions that will support biodiversity coming back onto UK farms, are actually brilliant in terms of mitigating climate impacts as well as adapting to them. So I'd say to businesses on the call, please contact us to find out more. We urgently need to respond, and the RSPB is there to work with you to address those things that really matter to your customers. So thank you for joining us.
Thank you. So, Jo, Andy, Mark, thank you very much for bringing so much energy, insight to the conversation with our colleagues on the call. Thank you for joining us, everybody. Keep well, and remember, there's an emergency. The food system's at the heart of it, and we've all got a role in solving it as well. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mike. Thank you, Jo.